Hey Squishies! Back again with another vlog. This is Ducktales, the pilot. Um, I'm hugely excited that this show is coming back. This is a very big show for me personally. Ducktales was a huge deal for me as a kid. It was really kind of my first fan experience. The first time I was watching a show more than just something that was on and I enjoyed watching it, but as something that, sucked me in and I cared about. And I think it was that for a lot of people. So here we are, 30th anniversary of the show coming back. It's also Scrooge's 150th birthday, at least according to the timeline that Don Rosa created for him. The same timeline had Scrooge dying in 1967, though, so... Still, for the events of his life to line up, he's got to be somewhere around that old for him to have participated in the Klondike Gold Rush as a young man. Regardless, DuckTales was a huge show in the late 80s. It was a show that combined good writing, for the time, good animation. Even looking at it today, it's not bad. It's a little stiff, a little limited by modern standards, but for TV animation at the time, for something where they made 65 episodes in 1 year, it's pretty good. So DuckTales was enormous. It was well animated, it was well written, it was hugely, wildly successful, and this was at a time where most animation on American television was cheaply made, cheaply produced, formulaic, heavy use of recycled animation, heavy use of repeated plot elements. DuckTales didn't do that anywhere near as much. And that kind of distinguished it, because here was a show that broke all the rules for how to make animation successful, because cartoons were cheap things that didn't do well, or you got funding from a toy company. DuckTales did neither of those things. DuckTales was not all that cheap, though still pretty cheap thanks to the use of Japanese studios, which at the time were quite cheap, sort of the equivalent of Korean studios today. And the fact that it was just hugely popular, hugely successful. And that utterly transformed the landscape for cartoons. Without DuckTales, you don't have Warner Brothers seeing that and going, oh, we need our own thing, let's team up with Steven Spielberg and make Tiny Toon Adventures. Without that, you don't get Animaniacs, you don't get the DC Animated Universe, you essentially don't get the entire TV side of what film-focused folks refer to as the Disney Renaissance. In TV, it was Disney and Warner Brothers both, and then other companies started joining in. It's a huge deal. It revolutionized, essentially, children's television, because DuckTales was suitable for an older group of children. Cartoons in the 80s were very heavily aimed at very small children. I remember being 6 years old and feeling like I was getting a little too old for cartoons. They were a little young. And DuckTales informed me that no, I was not. It came just as I was 6, just as I was starting to think about that. I was in first grade. I was like, I'm not so sure about whether, cartoons are for little kids, not grown-up six-year-olds like me. And DuckTales came along and I was like, you know what? No, I like this. I'm going to watch this. And screw anybody who thinks that I'm too old for it. And that is an attitude that I've maintained ever since. So, yeah, it impacted me a lot. And so, hearing about the reboot, I was, both skeptical and excited. as you are when you hear about a reboot of something that you really loved. It's like, well, on the one hand, I could get more of this thing I love, or I could get a better version of this thing I love, or I could get something awful. And happily, that is not what happened. Because DuckTales was not a perfect show. By modern standards, it's a bit slow-paced. The characters are quite shallow. In particular, the nephews are interchangeable and indistinguishable, and as they were intended to be. And Webby is interchangeable with and indistinguishable from every female character on 80s television. Or 80s children's television. She's indistinguishable from, Smurfette or any of a bajillion other, lone girl in the group of boys types of characters. It's also jaw-droppingly racist. The way it depicts East Asian people in particular and Native American people are horrifying. They are just lifted out of comics from the 1950s and dropped into the cartoon with no thought to, hey, maybe this wasn't necessarily the best way to depict people. So Native Americans are straight out of adventure serials and cowboy movies, and the East Asians are straight out of World War II propaganda. It's bad. It's really bad. Like hard to watch level bad. They are clearly taking steps to fix that with the new show. There's clear signs in there that they're doing that. The biggest change is definitely Webby, and I love it. I forget the actress's name, but she's Sadie from Steven Universe. She's in Garfunkel and Oates, and she's perfect. She's playing this very excitable, energetic, kind of lonely kid. And she just does it perfectly. Like, Webby is just great. Webby immediately jumps out as just this immensely likable character, where in the old show she was boring and annoying, and any episode focused on her is very prone to being boring and sappy. Here we've got someone much more fun, much more energetic, but at the same time there is still kind of this layer of pathos which is being played as, for jokes right now, but they could do something with and could tap into some of the qualities of the 80s version of Webby, because she wasn't she did have a couple of positive traits. She wasn't completely terrible. And they could have some of that. So, like, for example, the 80s Webby would instantly make friends. She was always open and warm and willing and wanting to make friends with every new person or creature she met. And there's a little bit of that in this version of Webby, the way she pretty much instantly makes friends with the boys, which is in contrast to the old show where essentially Huey, Dewey, and Louie were the only people that Webby couldn't make friends with. They saw her as the bratty little sister. I like that. I like that they're keeping that element of her character while getting rid of some of the more annoying elements or boring elements. I've seen some people comparing her to Mabel from Gravity Falls. I'm not sure I see it. Webby is honestly a little more like Dipper, if anything. She's a lonely kid who's kind of obsession-prone and craves adventure and very excitable. Those all sound more like Dipper to me than Mabel, which is cool. Gender swap Dipper is a fun idea. And it's not 100% bad either. Like I said, they're definitely keeping some elements of the 80s one while making her a far more interesting and fun character. And then the boys, Huey, Dewey, and Louie, They've done a lot to differentiate the three of them, starting with giving them 3 different actors instead of having one person voice all of them. And giving them distinct personalities. What I like is that they've each kind of got a piece of what makes up Scrooge. Because we see in the course of this pilot that Huey is very, he's a planner. He, knowledgeable, has good ideas, makes plans, kind of the leader. But it takes that a little bit too far with the whole family road trip thing. But that's a big element of who Scrooge is. Scrooge is someone who does his research, knows the lore, makes plans, sometimes quite elaborate ones. He's a smart guy, and Huey reflects that. Then Dewey is, the adventurer. He's impulsive and wants to prove himself and wants excitement. Again, that's a big part of who Scrooge is. He's a little bit of an adrenaline junkie. And then Louis is materialistic and acquisitive and doesn't much seem to care what other people think of him. When the others call him the evil twin, he's like, or evil triplet, he's like, eh. And he's got the mischievous streak. And those are also big parts of who Scrooge is, So I like that they kind of gave each of them a piece of his character, while also each of them stands out as, distinct. Although they have these shared elements of personality with Scrooge, that's what they are. They're shared elements of personality. They're things that they have in common, not, clones. Love that they're including Donald more. While I was a huge fan of the show, I did eventually start reading the comics. Fairly quickly, actually. I think I was 7 or 8 when I started reading the comics. And Donald is a much bigger figure there, but he's a very different character in the comics than he is in the cartoons, really any of the cartoons. Comics Donald he's a seasoned adventurer. He's, what Webby described him as. Whereas Cartoon Donald is, the excitable, angry, perpetually unlucky character. Although the unlucky part there is a little bit of. There's a lot of single-page comics that are just Scrooge getting one up on Donald in some way, due to Donald's perpetual bad luck. Donald is still the perpetual loser, but he's also much more, adventurous, and is essentially Scrooge's sidekick in the comics. I like that they've hybridized that. They've taken the cartoon version, who's, excitable and angry and unlucky, and made him also this seasoned adventurer, and made those two halves balance each other out really well. I'm really impressed with the acting that's been done with Donald. I think it's still Tony Anselmo, who's the same person who's been voicing him since the 80s, as far as I know. If so, he's really got the part down by now. He was not in the original show very much, but when he was, Donald was very kind of a 2-note character. There was really just angry Donald and calm Donald. He's got a lot more range in this, He shows a lot of emotion. He shows different kinds of anger. There's the, narrow-eyed, glaring at Scrooge anger, and the waving his arms around, getting ready to punch an invisible, non-existent person anger, and a whole bunch of other emotions beside. He does a really good job with all of that. There's a lot of other little changes too. Mrs. Beakley, drastically altered character, and I like what they've done with her. She seems to have absorbed kind of most of Duckworth's role, the butler in the original show. And I think that's not a bad move because it gives her a little more personality. Now she gets to be the one who's snarking back at Scrooge. They've combined this with her being like super strong or something. Like she throws a pen and it buries itself in the wall. Like there's something going on there. And she's trained Webby to be, you know, a good enough fighter that she can take out like one of Glomgold's hired mercenaries. So there's clearly something going on there with Mrs. Beakley, but I like that. I like that they're kind of expanding out her character. Anything else about the characters I wanted to say? I can't think of anything else I wanted to say about the characters. The story was great. I like that they kind of took the core concept of the earliest Scrooge stories, that he's initially this kind of greedy, reclusive, miserly person, and, you know, a past adventurer who's now retired, and, you know, the boys kind of rekindle him to rediscover his love of adventure. That's kind of the core concept of the earliest Scrooge stories, as opposed to like the old Ducktales. Its pilot had Scrooge being already an adventurer and just not thinking much of the boys. They kind of forced themselves in. They were dumped on him because Donald was joining the Navy, and then he tried to shut them out of his life, and they kind of forced their way in. This, I think this works a little better because it gives Scrooge a real motivation for trying to keep them out, which is that he's given up, and he doesn't want to be forced to face that he's kind of given up. I like that, but I like also that they've gone their own way with it. It's very different from those original stories. It's an original story that has the same general concept behind it. I also like that kind of they split it into two halves. The first half is the boys and Webby kind of earning Scrooge's trust and rekindling his desire for adventure. Then we get the actual DuckTales theme, and then we get their first adventure. That's a good way to split it up, I think. And that first adventure then sets up the rest of the premise. It ends with them and Donald coming to live with him so that we can just kind of go from here with the DuckTales adventures. I definitely approve this way of structuring the story. And of course there's the little mystery at the very end that they throw in with Adela that kind of recontextualizes a lot of stuff before that with Donald and Scrooge. Della is a minor character from the comics. She's Huey, Dewey, and Louie's mother. If I recall correctly, their father has never appeared. Only been vaguely referenced to. I don't think we even know what his name is. So she's always been Donald's sister, their parent. Here we have her as a second sidekick to Scrooge. There's Donald and there's her. So a good way to take it, because I know in some of the Dutch or German or something like that comics, she's an ace pilot who has this real thirst for adventure. So that would fit well with the Donald and Scrooge adventures that are implied to have taken place at some point in the past. It seems likely that whatever this Spear of Selene thing is that Donald brings up in the second half of the pilot as being, when they're all about to get killed in the death trap, he says this is the Spear of Selene all over again. Scrooge, only loves adventure and doesn't care about anything else. That's probably where Della died, or disappeared, or something. And it seems clear that that's what ended their partnership. Something happened to Della. Donald had to take care of the triplets after that, and Scrooge retired from adventuring. As did Donald, of course. But that recontextualizes earlier comments when Donald says stuff like, he owes me. Not just for, years of being his adventuring sidekick, but for whatever happened to Della. It's a nice little touch of darkness that really helps make the adventure qualities of the show. Visually, it's fantastic. I love the background art in particular. It's very comics influenced. I even spotted some halftones being used for shading, which even comics barely do anymore. Really evokes the spirit of the old comics and really kind of says, yes, this is a reboot of the cartoon, but we're drawing heavily on the comics too. Which is good, because those comics are among the most popular in the world. It's just a good move to be drawing on them, and they're frankly astoundingly good. The classic Carl Barks comics, the Don Rosa comics, Life of Times of Scrooge McDuck is one of the best graphic novels ever written, period. It's on my shelf right there with Alan Moore stuff. Very, very different, obviously, but still fantastically good. And the show captures that while being stylistically quite original. It does not look very much at all like the old show. The character designs are much squatter and broader, obviously especially Glomgold, but everyone is squatter and broader. The nephews are now proportioned like children instead of smaller versions of the adults. They've got bigger heads and rounder bodies, whereas in the old show and mostly in the comics and other animations, they were just shrunken versions of the adults with smaller beaks. Visually it looks great. Already can tell they're having a lot of fun with Glomgold. He had the best lines of the episode easily. His line about treasure is the greatest treasure, that's why it's called treasure, that was great. Even better was his, McDuck thinks he's so Scottish, I have a kilt. Those were great lines. That latter one will be especially funny if Glomgold turns out to be South African like he is in the comics, and not even really Scottish at all. That would be a really fun way to combine the comics version and the cartoon version, which was Scottish. What else? Couple of negatives, not overall this was immensely good. There's a couple of things that just maybe one of them is probably inescapable, which is the fact that Scrooge is a multi-billionaire. They reference trillionaire in the show. In the comics, they usually used made-up words for numbers. He is, however rich it is necessary to be the richest person in the world and have essentially unlimited resources to spend on adventures. That's how wealthy he is. And probably then some. That's always been a little problematic, simply because of his constant declaration, that he made his money fair and square by being smart and tough, that it's all his own doing, but we know it's not. He owns a giant company. McDuck Enterprises is this massive conglomerate that he owns. So It's always been untrue, that claim, because he's always had workers. In the show, I think they kind of poked a little fun at that as far as they can, in the sense that when he gives his, tougher than a toughies line, never needed any help, he immediately tumbles over and asks for Mrs. Beakley's help. The snarky servant, whose job is to poke fun at these kinds of class issues. So there's that. I'm curious if we'll ever get something as great as the episode where, in the old series, where Scrooge loses his memory, which is always a terrible premise for an episode, but they went good places with it. He loses his memory, ends up getting a job at a factory he owns, without realizing it, and eventually ends up organizing a union and staging a strike. It's a great episode for these kinds of issues. Basically, Scrooge is a libertarian fantasy. There's no such thing as a self-made man. He's always been this libertarian fantasy, and so it's a little to be putting that out there, but they do seem to be at least a little bit poking at it, so that's good. Other issue is, of course, the Indiana Jones issue in general. I'm going to go adventuring into somebody else's place where we know other people live because their buildings are there. I'm going to go adventuring into somebody else's place, take their sacred artifacts, and cart them off home. Why? Because I'm the first white person to find them, and therefore I own them. It's always been an issue with the character in general, going all the way back to his beginnings, and with this type of adventurer character. In this episode, they mostly get around that with using a fictional city belonging to a people who never existed, and even in the context of the show, no longer exist, which is nice. I don't see how they can possibly sustain that. Eventually, he's going to be going into ruins that at least evoke a real-world culture, and that's where things get a little... Again, it's not a huge thing, but given the show's, the fact that it's a reboot of a show that had serious problems with racism, it's definitely, and it's not like a character like Grunkle Stan, who is essentially a bad guy that's on the good guy's side, he's cares about his family and all that stuff, but he's still repeatedly depicted as being an utter asshole. No, Scrooge is the hero, and generally depicted as one in the old show, and seems to be in the same light in this show, so it's a little, not to say that can't be done and it can't still be a good show, but it's definitely sounding a sour note. On the same lines is the dragon, Pishu, that shows up at the climax of the first half. They took an Eastern dragon appearance, gave it the Western dragon trait of, craving gold, and sent it after the money bin. Again, not a huge thing, but given the legacy of Ducktales as having a huge problem with racism against East Asian people, saying, taking the Chinese dragon design and then saying, oh no, the Chinese were wrong about how dragons behave. They behave like European dragons, is a little dicey. Again, these are quibbles. These are really relatively minor things. Overall, the show is fantastic. It's a really strong, solid start to what I suspect is going to shape up to be an excellent show. I love that they've already made noises about adding a little bit of diversity, because the original show was basically everyone was either coded white or a racist caricature. Nothing in between. In the new show, we've already got confirmation that Fenton is going to be made Hispanic, which is awesome. I suspect, I don't know, they haven't had many lines yet, so I can't say for sure, but I suspect that's also why we're getting differently colored ducks, not in the sense that like they're gonna delve into race and racism, like, oh yeah, there's a long history of racism against dark green ducks, but just I think they're doing that in part to remove the way in which everyone is white coated. Now, at least some of the ducks aren't literally white. Time will tell if that's actually the direction they're going with that. Either way, I like that they're adding a bit of diversity. Other than that, I don't think I have much to say. It's a great show. It's a really strong start, and I'm really looking forward to more come September, which will be the actual 30th anniversary of the old show. Yeah, so hopefully I will see you all then. It should be around the time I finish Gravity Falls, too, which is great timing. Alright, see you all then. Bye!